This week on The Sceptic, I speak to William Yarwood of the Taxpayers Alliance on Labour's welfare farce.
After all the concessions that they've made and all the backtracking that they've done, the bill is not going to save £5 billion. It's not going to save £2.5 billion. It's actually going to spend an extra 100 to extra £400 million. So this welfare reform bill has just been a complete farce.
Niall Gooch, writer and public servant, on the Catholic Lib Dem MP who complained that it was disrespectful when he was denied Holy Communion for voting in favour of assisted suicide.
There's a difference when someone is publicly living in a state of sin or has done something very seriously against the Church's witness, which voting for the assisted suicide bill does come under that category. But it's really that public element that's the difficulty in this situation.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Dr. Tilak Doshi, the Daily Sceptic's energy editor, on Trump's fight back against politicised climate science and the rise of King Coal.
Was it Mark Twain who said that news of my death had been vastly exaggerated? It's a perfect line for coal.
Hello and welcome to episode 43 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Now, it's been a farcical week for Labour's welfare bill. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by William Yarwood, campaigns manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. Welcome to The Sceptic, William.
Thanks for having me back on, Laurie. Great to talk to you as always, mate.
Yeah, good to have you here. So we're speaking on Wednesday morning after the dramatic conclusion to Labour's welfare bill, or really, disintegration of it, perhaps is more accurate. So there's a long tail to this story, William, but tell us about what happened yesterday. Yeah,
sure. I think the word disintegration is almost perfect way to describe it, because the bill did actually pass. The Rebel, there was about 49 of 50 Labour Rebel MPs, as well as obviously the Tories, the Lib Dems, the Greens and Reform all voting, and the SNP all voting against it. But they still managed to get it passed. But disintegration is possibly the correct word, because the bill that they've passed now is completely different from the one that Kendall originally proposed. So the bill has been watered down to such a degree that the savings that they were originally going to get, well, they're not going to get any of them. So just to give a sort of brief overview, originally the bill was supposed to save about £5 billion from the benefits bill overall. Now, we at the TPA think that is completely pathetic. £5 billion over the next 5 years is not even going to remotely touch the size of Britain's ballooning benefits bill. I mean, health-related benefits and disability-related benefits, that bill alone will hit £100 billion by 2029 if we go on current trends, right? So £5 billion in the next few years is not going to touch the sides with that kind of stuff. So they originally wanted to save £5 billion by reducing, making it harder to claim universal credit, making sure that there were more categories. So I think it was in terms of like a point system. So like you had to score a certain amount of points in order to get on a certain level of PIP and universal credit. Unfortunately for Kendall and Keir Starmer, they slightly underestimated the amount of trouble this would cause in the Labour Party, because I suppose maybe there's a level of arrogance from them because they've got quite a large majority, and even though they've had quite a few U-turns and quite a few problems over the last year, they've been pretty much able to get whatever they want through, and that's just a fact when you have a large majority. Like even towards the end of the last Tory regime with Sunak could get through pretty much everything he liked because, hey, he still had like an 80-seat majority, which he inherited from Boris. So Labour thought they'd be able to push this through. Yes, they expected some rebellions, but they got cold feet quite quickly. So they ended up giving concessions to the rebels on things like the points system I mentioned there. They ended up giving concessions regarding like cutting PIP entirely. And so the £5 billion they were supposed to save over the next few years became, as the Resolution Foundation found out, became about 2.5 billion very, very quickly. So they halved it with their concessions. Now, yesterday, it got even worse. So the things that were left in the welfare bill, I think Chris Mason sort of highlighted this on the BBC just earlier today. He said that there's only two things really left in the welfare bill now, which is actually raising the standard rate of universal credit. So that's not cutting money, that's increasing it, right? And they are still keeping the reduction in the health element of UC. So to begin with, the first bit, the raising the standard rate of universal credit, that's going to cost about £1.8 billion. Okay, so that's like not a small sum of money. And the reduction in the health element of universal credit, That's going to save £1.7 billion. So now, instead of saving £5 billion and then £2.5 billion, they're now actually spending an extra £100 million overall. So, like, where's the welfare reform here? All they've done here, and also if you include the money that they're spending, the £300 million they're spending on employment support, which is something like we do support. There's nothing wrong with money being put towards helping people on benefits get back into work. What they call the right to try scheme, where, people who are on PIP can, try to get onto the welfare, get out of the welfare spiral and get onto the job ladder. That's going to cost about £300 million, and that's still left in. So yeah, really, after all the concessions that they've made and all the backtracking that they've done, the bill is not going to save £5 billion. It's not going to save £2.5 billion. It's actually going to spend an extra 100 to extra £400 million. So this welfare reform bill has just been a complete farce. And to see Kendall and Starmer still celebrating it as a win just shows you that, they are just trying to spin this in a way that makes them look good. But to be quite frank with you, as with most things the Labour government's been doing, nobody's buying it. And their backbenchers still want the bill not just to be, disintegrated as you said it has been. They want it to be just repealed in its entirety, and they're not going to stop the debate. Even though the vote was yesterday, this debate isn't going to just stop now.
And it's almost incredible how badly this has been misplayed by Starmer and his team. Because, of course, there was a suggestion to begin with that they were going to play hardball over this. And, for instance, they were going to say to their backbenchers that they wouldn't get a ministerial position if they voted against this and sort of other threats. But in the end, they just ended up giving up concession after concession. And we've reached this point. I mean, why did they politically miscalculate so much?
If I'm honest with you, Laurie, I just don't think this government's particularly good at politics. I just don't think it's very good at it. I think Keir Starmer, as I said earlier, had this sort of feeling in his mind, like saying, well, I'm still the Prime Minister. I know my poll ratings are low, but I've still got a huge majority. And even if there is some rebellion, I can still push this through to some extent. But I think there was just endless misstepping. And I think conceding quickly was a bad thing. I think actually what Labour and Kendall should have done, even though, like I said earlier, I think the bill was weak to begin with, I think that if stuck by their guns and said, no, we need this £5 billion in reduction, they could have used the whole, the Tories left the welfare state in a mess and Labour are fixing it, and sort of went with that angle. If they decided to just double down and say, no, these reforms are needed and we're doing them whether our backbenchers like them or not, they would have likely still passed the bill, right? They would have still likely passed the bill. The 49-50 rebel Labour MPs would have voted against it no matter what they were given, right? So Liz Kendall has conceded to backbench rebels only for the rebels to then still vote down the bill, right? So the concessions were just, they're a stepping stone for these rebels to get the bill thrown out in its entirety, which is, I think, Rachel Maskell, who is the lead Rebel MP, said this morning she still wants to get rid of it. So even after all these concessions, they're still not happy. So Kendall and Starmer should have noticed this and thought about this at the forefront, thinking, will these people actually back down? Are backbench rebels doing this because they have genuine concerns about the way the bill is, or do they just hate the bill in its entirety? And I think it's quite clear from people who are looking at this from the outset, it's quite clear that they just hate the bill entirely, because Labour MPs, for reasons that are easily explained, do not like cutting welfare, like simple as, because the Labour Party is the party of the welfare state. I mean, they invented the damn thing after all, with Attlee and the post-war consensus. So why on earth would they want to reduce the size of it? The arguments they made in the House of Commons yesterday, some of it was complete hyperbole. There were some Labour MPs talking about how it was, this bill was Dickensian, which I think was absolutely just shows how out of touch and insane some of these MPs are, that they're using that kind of language to describe what is incredibly wet welfare reform. Imagine if Kendall had done something way more radical, right? Imagine what they'd be calling it then. But they were also complaining and saying, I came into politics not to make people poorer. I came into politics because I'm compassionate and I care and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, that's all fine. But the statistics bear out the reality that Britain's welfare bill is completely unaffordable, and that actually the welfare bill that they were all voting on was not even going to touch the sides or reform any of the system. Like, again, with the right to try stuff, I'm not against that in principle. I think that's a good idea. But the way in which they were changing universal credit and PIP, I mean, again, that was just not going to change the system. We've seen an explosion, which we can talk about a little bit later, an explosion in the amount of people claiming PIP for all sorts of things. So, yeah, I think Starmer and Kendall originally thought that, we're in charge. I'm sure that reasonable backbench Labour MPs will get on board. But they should have recognised that these rebels were not interested in concessions. They were interested in putting the bill out to pasture. So they should have just been more resolute from the forefront, which actually kind of, in a way, sort of a final point, it sort of shows how Starmer, I think, thinks he's somewhat losing a little bit of control over his Labour backbenchers, and I've seen some other people talk about that. I'm not going to go as far as to say that Starmer's a lamed up prime minister and it's over for him, as I've seen some commentators do, because I think that's a little bit, far at the moment. We're only a year in to Labour being in power, right? And they've still got a large majority and they've still been able to pass whatever they've liked. Starmer can stay there for another 4 years and still get quite a lot done. But it has proven that Starmer is starting to realise that the backbench, murmurings are now actually turning into votes against his government. And I think what you might see over the next few months, and even in the autumn statement, what you might see is concessions to backbenchers in regards to child benefit cap, in regards to, maybe top rate of tax, in regards to, funding for their local areas, because lots of these MPs just sort of live action role play as councillors and care only about funding for their areas and sort of pork barrel politics. All the while then saying, oh, well, we need to pay for it, and then maybe considering hiking taxes in the autumn. So, yeah, Starmer and Kendall have played this terribly, and I think, as the leader of the opposition said yesterday, Kemi Badenoch, it was a complete waste of time. Like, nothing's changed, nothing's happened. A complete waste of time. And as to say, the amount of money, the amount of time they've spent on this, the amount of political capital they've spent on this, and they've achieved nothing.
So, of course, there's this massive political misjudgment there, but I suppose part of that is explained by the fact that Keir Starmer's heart wasn't really in it in the first place. Yeah,
there's always this discussion around Starmer's political views, isn't there? I sort of see both sides. There's the one side which is basically Starmer's a ruthless pragmatist who has no opinions and cares virtually only about being in power. Like, that's one argument. Then there's the argument that basically says Starmer has changed his political opinions in order to basically win power, but still actually believes everything he said when he first ran for leader back in 2020 or whenever it was, which is basically basically a Corbynite platform, right? Which is, increasing the top rate of tax, open borders, immigration, massive welfare spending, all nationalising utilities, railways, which, to be fair, they have done in that regard. And maybe Starmer's heart wasn't in it. I don't know specifically about Starmer, but I know various cabinet ministers' hearts weren't in it. I mean, the Telegraph had a piece this morning, actually, that is explaining how Rayner was actually the biggest sort of internal cabinet rebel to this kind of stuff. And while she didn't organise the backbench rebels in any way, I mean, she might have been involved, we don't know, but she was easily the most vocal against these cuts. And people underestimate, well, perhaps they don't underestimate, considering now they've known what Rayner's like for a year or so. Rayner's power inside the Labour Party is quite decent, right? It's quite good. She's liked. I mean, when she was doing Deputy Prime Minister's questions, well, PMQ, she was stepping in for the PM for the last 2 weeks. She was loving it. The smile on her face, standing over the box and having a go at, Mel Stride, who was sent, bless him, to go in Kemi's place. And the backbenchers are in uproar and they're all going, yeah, Angela, and that kind of stuff. They do like her. They like Angela a lot because she's got a bit of personality, and also because she is authentically on the left. While, like I said earlier, some people question whether Starmer actually believed anything he said back then. So, yeah, I don't specifically know to that one. Maybe Starmer's heart wasn't in it. Maybe his heart is just not in this area of politics. Maybe he wants to do other things rather than welfare reform. But Kendall's heart was certainly in it. She genuinely believes in her bill, but the bill she's got now, even though she's radically defending it on TV and going, "Oh, this is still a win for this Labour government, and welfare reform is still going to be pursued," It quite frankly isn't. And anyone who tells you otherwise, at least from the Labour side, is telling you a pack of lies.
And so looking at actual fiscal policy then, of course, this is in the context of Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules and the deficit. I mean, William, does this mean we're going to have tax rises?
Well, it's interesting. Pat McFadden was sent out on the media round this morning, and he ruled out unequivocally tax rises. But he mentioned the main three that they keep mentioning, which is, of course, income tax, national insurance, namely, not employers' national insurance, which, of course, they did hike, but employees' national insurance and VAT. Now, Labour's been promising that since before they came into power. Right, they did the whole sort of old-fashioned Tony Blair thing of like, we're not going to raise taxes on working people, without being able to define what a working person is, and then hiking, taxes on farmers and small businesses. Those are working people, are they not? Are they not, folks? But they said they've ruled that out again, which from a fiscal point of view, I mean, obviously from a TPA perspective, obviously I don't want national insurance, income tax, or VAT to be increased, although VAT is possibly the less distortive tax because at least it affects everyone, and you can raise revenue decently from it. Because they don't want to raise those three kind of taxes, which are the three most lucrative taxes to raise and get consistent, sustainable income from, they've put themselves in a corner again. I mean, like I said earlier, now that this bill is going to cost an extra 400 million pounds to the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves needs to find that £5 billion, supposedly. She needs to find some more headroom because it's gone away. So, yeah, I think that there will be tax rises in the autumn. I'm not going to mince my words about it. There'll be tax rises. What they're going to do is, I don't know. I mean, what can they do? I mean, they've already slammed farmers. They've already slammed small businesses with the national insurance hike. Are they going to just break their promise and touch the top rate of tax? Are they going to go for something mental like a wealth tax? Again, I'm not sure there's appetite from Starmer and various members of the cabinet for a wealth tax because they know they don't work and they're really hard to implement. But, what else can they do at this point? Because there's no appetite to cut spending, as we've just seen from the welfare reform malarkey that's just gone on. Labour MPs don't even want to cut £5 billion, right? They don't even want to cut £5 billion out of it. So yeah, I think there will be tax rises in the autumn, and watch this space. They might do something more with inheritance tax. They might come after, they might refreeze the thresholds, which Rachel Reeves said she would unfreeze on income tax, which means more and more people will be dragged into top bands of income tax, squeezing middle earners to the degree where they're paying marginal rates of tax of, 50, 55%. So yeah, I think that the tax rises will be coming, and watch this space because, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have come into power and said, we're not going to tax working people. And yet at every autumn statement, thus far, when they come to the next one, every single time they would have taxed working people. So, yeah, it's coming.
And of course, William, this is quite a technical, statistical issue in some ways, and people can't always necessarily visualize the difference between 5 billion, 50 billion, or any of these figures. And so the Taxpayers Alliance has done a brilliant job of bringing out this benefits dashboard so that people can really visualize how much the benefits bill is already and is going to be ballooning. And, well, tell us a bit about that. But of course, you and I were speaking last time about the personal independence payment. And one of the things you can see very much on that is just how much that one has ballooned, in particular since lockdown.
Yeah, we decided to crunch some DWP data from Stat Explore regarding not just national spending on benefits overall, but amount of work capability assessments that have been submitted, PIP claims, enhanced Motability PIP, which me and you have talked about at great length before about, and I have a personal interest in, and then DLA payments as well. So we've created a benefits dashboard. So if people watching this want to go check it out, it's just benefitsdata.uk. You click on a few things. You can break it down by constituency, by region, by postcode, by local authority. So you can see actually how PIP and enhanced rate of mobility PIP have exploded in your area. So yeah, it's quite staggering. I mean, I'll just rattle off some statistics for you. Almost 1 in 10 Brits now receive personal independent payments in England and Wales. Almost 1 in 10. And there's some areas in the UK where it's above 1 in 10. So out of the 318 local authorities that we have in the UK, 108 of them have people in there, have above 1 in 10 people claiming PIP in those areas. And as we found, unfortunately for those living in Wales, I'm sorry about this, but Wales is possibly the worst place for this kind of stuff. I mean, if you look at the top 10 local authority areas with the most claimants per 1,000 people, Blanw Gwent is in Wales. That's number one with 211 people per 1,000 claiming PIP. Merthyr Tydfil, 204 per 1,000 claiming PIP. Port Talbot, 195 per 1,000. Caerphilly, 108 per 1,000. Rhondda Cynon Taf, can't pronounce. I grew up in Wales and I still can't pronounce Welsh things. 173 per 1,000. There's large areas of Wales where there are, above 1 in 10 people claiming PIP, and that's scary. That's depressing, and this has all grown since 2019.
And do you have a sense of why that is, William?
So we've talked about this before. It's since lockdown. All of these stats, if you go on our data dashboard, you'll notice that basically we go from January 2019 till just literally the other month of this year, sort of June, May of 2025. It's a combination of, first of all, I think just the sickness of Britain post-COVID. People got used to sort of receiving benefits, and I think Sam Ashworth Hayes put it in the Telegraph. If other people are using the benefit system like nobody had done, but people hadn't done to such an extent as they had during COVID, once you're exposed to what you can get from the state, you feel like almost a bit of a mug not taking it, right? Because if someone else down the road is, driving in a lovely electric BMW thanks to the Motability scheme, or is receiving, tens of thousands of pounds a year on mobility and universal credit PIP, why on earth would you not do that either? I mean, you look at some of the things that have, increased ADHD, anxiety, things that previously you would have just considered being part of, not normal parts of life per se, but, with depression and anxiety, that's just a sort of emotional state. I get anxious, I can be miserable. Everyone can, but just because you're anxious or miserable doesn't mean it should entitle you to get on the enhanced rate of mobility PIP and then trade it in for a car. I think that the COVID's got a lot to play for this, but we've sort of discussed that before. One thing I will mention, which I didn't mention last time I talked to you, is to do with in-person assessments. So before COVID, about 80 to 85% of assessments for PIP were done in person, which obviously gives you more of an idea of what that person's actually like. Are they actually gaming it? Are they genuine? Do they have genuine problems, and so on and so forth. During COVID, obviously that disappeared up thin air because people stayed at home for obvious reasons. Now that hasn't returned, the in-person assessments. That's not returned to pre-COVID levels. Only about 2%, between 2 and 4% of people now claiming PIP do in-person assessments. So the majority of it's done online. And, when you're online and over Zoom, there's a different kind of relationship. And also many of these people doing these kind of assessing will have to siphon through multiple calls a day. And they'll just, hear a trigger word like, depression or suicide or whatever the trigger word of that gets them on, the system does. They'll go tick, excellent, move on, and they'll go to the next person. And also there's obviously an immigration point to make here. Obviously immigration has drastically risen since 2019. It's pride. I mean, we don't have the specific, breakdown in regards to, nationality and stuff, because we've only looked at England and Wales. And also, to be fair, some of the areas that we looked at, whether it's in Wales or in sort of areas in Merseyside in England, those areas haven't been radically hit by mass immigration yet. And yet these areas still have high amounts of PIP claimants. But immigration will certainly play a part in it, because, the more people you have in the country, the more economically inactive people you have in a country, the more likely those kind of people are going to be able to get onto the welfare state via, going to a job centre or whatever it might be, and then asking for an interpreter, and then, saying things to the interpreter in order to get them, a decent amount of money. So yeah, that's sort of a rough overview. I think COVID's the big one. I think the fact that in-person assessments haven't returned properly. I think immigration's a big issue, although, of course, like I said, there's no sort of breakdown in our statistics regarding that. But also, there is just a sort of general misery in the country at the moment where, you start working and you get taxed, and what you're paying into the tax system is actually, quite extortionate. And actually, for many people, it would be more financially advantageous just to, say, oh, I've got ADHD and anxiety and depression, and I'm fat and I'm an alcoholic, and but all these, use all the words and claim PIP, and it's not nice to say, Laurie, but that's a depressing reality for many people.
And I was also wondering, why do you think the PIP claimants are so overrepresented in Wales?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I was asked this question yesterday on GB News. And the answer I had for it basically is, I think Wales has been kind of ignored and left behind. I mean, a lot of these areas are they're not super well connected places. They're not areas where corporations and private businesses are investing in and setting up headquarters and things like that. It's not a place which is full of small business areas. And a lot of these areas will be old, coal mining towns and steel factory workers and things like that. And they have kind of just been left behind. And also because, Labour ran Wales. I mean, people forget about that. People, forget that there is a Welsh Assembly and that Labour has been in power since the Welsh Assembly was created back in the early 2000s by Tony Blair. And they've pretty much just run the country into the ground. I mean, I lived in Wales for all of my life, really. And I loved growing up where I grew up. But, even when I go home now, I notice the decline is a lot worse. There's more shuttered shops. It looks grayer. There's more people sort of moping around the streets in the middle of the day, not really doing anything with their lives. And there's just a sort of general sort of air of misery, I think, in some parts of Wales, and obviously in some parts of England, which, how do you solve that, right? How do you, as a government, go into these areas and provide some level of economic, relief almost, even if it's not taxpayer funded, economic relief and growth to these people? And how do you encourage small businesses and businesses to be set up in those areas to employ people? It's such a difficult issue, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have the answers for it, because I don't. But the difference is, I can admit that, Laurie, while politicians will pretend they have the answers when they don't either. So yeah, I mean, it's a depressing case for Wales, but I mean, the East Midlands is not doing any better. East of England's not doing any better. London's not doing any better. So yeah, there are areas, which are, I mean, like Wales actually, in terms of per population, has got a higher amount of people claiming PIP. But if you look at, say, the Northwest, for example, there's 593,100 people claiming PIP in April 2025. That's an average of 125 per 1,000 people, and is a 98% increase since 2019. 98%. That's a huge increase. In Wales, that was only an 88% increase. In Southwest, 106% increase. Southeast, 117% increase. Northeast, 89% increase. Yorkshire and Humber, 112% increase. I mean, it's skyrocketing through all the areas. So yeah, Wales is bad, but actually in terms of the overall increase, large areas of England are actually worse.
And so no less intractable of an issue, it is just the benefits bill more broadly. And of course, we've mentioned how Starmer misplayed it politically. Perhaps his heart wasn't in it. Certainly the hearts of members of his top team don't seem to have been in it. But I suppose, is this just an intractable problem now? I mean, how should Labour have done it? How would, a future government do it? Because it is something that does, have to be looked at.
Yeah, it does have to be tackled. But the issue we have in this country, Laurie, is we have politicians who are afraid to annoy the public. and afraid to tell them the reality of our financial situation. The Rob Coval at the CPS has a really fun term, which I thoroughly enjoy, is that the public isn't part of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, it's part of the cake and eat it party, which is basically what they want is they want low taxes and high spending, and also high spending on welfare. Often the reaction we get against this kind of stuff when we talk about welfare and benefits is saying, oh, well, if we didn't give all the money to migrants and we didn't have illegal migrant hotels and blah, 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 that would suddenly solve it and we'd be able to afford, massive welfare payments for everyone. So, simply not the case. As I said earlier, £100 billion on health and disability related benefits alone by 2029. Right? And anytime politicians try to touch it a little bit, as we've just seen, politicians themselves react hard against it because they're getting emails from their constituents complaining and saying, oh, no. Actually, what you need to do instead of reducing the welfare bill is actually just reduce it on immigrants. Or on the other side, no, you don't need to reduce the welfare bill. You just need to have a 2% tax on the very richest in society. So everyone has their own little sort of way out of dealing with the welfare bill. But from my perspective and from the TPA's perspective, look, there is no alternative. There is no alternative to getting this welfare bill down. It has to be cut and has to be gutted, and the assessments have to be put back in person. The criteria needs to be changed. But that's all radical stuff that I can say because I'm not running for office. But even the Tories and Reform, when they come out with, and I appreciate the fact that the Leader of the Opposition mentioned our research in the House of Commons yesterday. I really do, and she wrote a really good Telegraph piece for us as well on the issue. But the Tories still haven't got a very coherent policy plan on welfare reform. I've not seen it yet, and I know they're taking their time with policy, but I've not quite seen it. And Reform, Reform are now pro-welfare. Reform are pro getting rid of the 2-child benefit cap. Reform are pro, voted against the bill, but some of them didn't necessarily say why they were voting against the bill. But also they have an easy answer, which is, we'll just close the illegal migrant hotels and stop giving social housing to people in London, and that will suddenly solve the benefits bill. And it's like, yeah, I want to do all those things too, but you're still not going to touch the sides of the overall benefits bill by the end of this decade. I'm sorry, but there are no easy answers to this. So I think putting things back in person, I think, yes, obviously clamp down on, benefit fraud and, illegal and migrants gaming the system and things like that. That's fine. But also you're just going to have to cut it. And that's not a fun thing to say because that will hurt some people. But as long as there's the correct support to go along with it, like I mentioned earlier, not against Liz Kendall's right to try scheme at all. I think that's perfectly acceptable. And I think actually in terms of future welfare reform, Labour and both the Tories and Reform should focus on funding schemes to help people retrain and get back into work and get back on their feet, and also making sure that even if they are getting reskilled or retraining, that they can still receive benefits until they get back into work, basically, so that they're not just going out of benefits and onto training where they're not getting paid and they've got no money at all, because that's not fair. But yeah, there's no alternative. The welfare bill needs to be cut, and and that includes the winter fuel payments. They've reneged on that and U-turned on that, and now that's going to cost them an extra few £billion a year. The state pension still going up in line with inflation thanks to the triple lock. That is going to bankrupt the country. Public sector pensions, which are completely gold-plated and protected, but completely unaffordable. Unfunded pension liabilities as well, completely unaffordable. And these aren't sexy, cool issues to deal with. They're depressing and they're complicated and they're hard. And I think unless politicians over the next few years, especially on the right, get serious about some ideas of how to solve these issues, when they come into power in 2029, if Labour does lose, whether it's the Tories or Reform or whomever, they're just going to face the same issues, and they're going to have to, they're just going to have to level with the British public and say, sorry, yeah, we just can't afford this massive welfare state, and we can't tax you anymore because people will just leave, we can't go on as we've been going on for the last few years. It has to change, and that's going to take some pretty harsh, measures. But look, if Javier Milei in Argentina can do it, I'm sure there's politicians in this country with a spine and the courage to do it. It's just the they need to stand up and say it, and actually also present a coherent policy platform. So that's what I'd say. Yeah, there's no alternative. It needs to be cut and needs to be dealt with.
Right, and so there's the courage to do it once you're in office. But of course, the final question is electorally. Do they lead with this, or do they sort of do in many ways what Labour did with this Ming Vase strategy, which was not to be very clear at all about what they were going to do, and then suddenly just kind of wallop people over the heads with this once they got into office?
Yeah, there's been an argument I've heard before from some commentators, which is basically when you get into government, you can just do things. Like you don't have to ask the public's opinion on everything for everything. Like if you get elected, and obviously I would include it in the manifesto. Like that would be a lie to not include it in the manifesto. You need to put like a coherent welfare policy platform in the manifesto, and you should talk about it, but it shouldn't be like the staple of it, right? You should campaign on something that's that's really, really popular and that people can really get behind, which is, of course, immigration and criminal justice reform. It's also Brits are actually okay with reducing the size of the state if you're talking about bureaucracy. So actually, maybe there's an element where finally politicians can talk about civil service reform to the public without being seen as boring or dull, because people do recognise that there is a bloated bureaucracy in Whitehall and also in their local town halls, which does need to be gutted and cut, and could save a lot of money if they did it that way. So I think, they could do the Ming Vase strategy, but I do think that it would be, inauthentic and lying to tell the British public, so we can just keep going on as we have been. I mean, the way Labour did it, of course, they never even talk about it. But what they did is they waited until they got into power and then, faffed around for a few months and went, oh, it's bad, guys. The £22 billion black hole, it's awful. We're going to have to do some very nasty things because of those Tories leaving the economy in such a mess. That was a clever strategy, right? And that means they had a justification for doing it. But if Reform and the Tories, and I mean this for Reform more probably than the Tories, because at least Kemi and various of her shadow cabinet ministers seem to be genuinely interested in building up a very coherent policy platform. I say this to Reform more. You're just caving into the cake and eat it party, right? You're just playing populist games with people's money. Remember, this isn't. This can be funded by borrowing, of course, and obviously that's another big issue. We can't just keep continuously borrow more and add to our national debt, which is already humongous. This is people's money you're talking about. And if you want to encourage wealth and prosperity like Farage and Tice and the others say they do, well, then you need to implement policies that actually encourage that, and not policies which mean that the tax burden will just have to go up and up and up because you're increasing child benefits, right? The politicians need to be honest about this, but politicians don't have a great track record of doing that, do they?
Indeed. Well, let's hope they get serious. William Yarwood, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you, Laurie. Great to talk to you.
Now, in the 17th century, Britain suffered a years-long and bloody civil war, principally over the question of the place in British public life of religion, and in particular of Catholicism. Well, it seems the more things change in our secular age, the more they stay the same. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Niall Gooch, who is a writer for the Catholic Herald and other publications and a public servant. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Niall.
Thank you very much, Laurie.
Yeah, good to have you here. So this week, this Lib Dem MP by the name of Chris Coughlin, who's a Catholic, has been denied Holy Communion by his priest for voting in favour of the assisted suicide bill. And, tell us a bit about what happened there and what was your reaction to it?
Well, yeah, so Chris Coughlin, who's, as I say, is a Liberal Democrat MP, and he was warned by his parish priest that if he voted for the assisted suicide bill, the Ledbetter assisted suicide bill at third reading, he would be denied communion, because in the Catholic understanding, communion isn't just something that the church does together as a communal event. It is a sacrament. It is the body and blood, soul and divinity of Jesus Christ. And there are strict rules, possibly not the best well-observed rules in the world, but there are strict rules about making an examination before you receive communion. And if you're aware of what Catholics call mortal sin, you're not meant to participate. That's a decision you make yourself. Also, priests have the authority and the power, if they are aware of someone who is in a state of, I suppose, public sin or public contradiction of the church's teaching, they also have the discretion to take that decision to not give that person communion, because there's in one of St. Paul's letters in the New Testament, he talks about not receiving unworthily, i.e. if you're in a state of great sinfulness, or in some way your life is contradicting what the church says. And the church sees it as not a punishment really, but what they'd call a medicinal sanction. So it's to help you, because it's bad for you to take communion when you're in that state of rebellion, if you want to call it that, or sinfulness. It's not good for you spiritually. And that excommunication, as it's sometimes called, is supposed to be a way of recalling you to full fellowship with the church. Obviously, that is quite an unusual way of thinking in modern Britain, even for a lot of Christians who maybe don't have that same sacramental understanding of Holy Communion, or don't have that same high view of communion. So I think that's partly where the clash has arisen, is that people see communion as something that the community does together and a sign of, I suppose, horizontal unity. And someone being excluded from that looks like the church just being punitive and trying to enforce a political line, whereas there's really a lot more to it than that.
So we'll get into that tension in a second. But just as for Chris Coughlin, is there a way for him to get back into the church's good graces? I mean, he's already done the vote. What does this mean for him if he wants to have Holy Communion in the future?
Well, all he needs to do really is to go to confession and make a genuine, what Catholics call a good confession, which involves being genuinely sorry and accessing the grace of forgiveness through the sacrament of confession. So it's not that he's been excluded forever as a kind of punishment. Again, it's about maintaining the integrity of the church's public witness. So some people say things like, well, you've got all these people lining up for communion, and I bet some of them are cheating on their wives or embezzling money at work or whatever. And I'm quite sure that's true in some churches, but there's a difference when someone is publicly living in a state of sin or has done something very seriously against the church's witness, which voting for the assisted suicide bill does come under that category. So I think that's the difficulty sometimes people have as well, is that it can appear like certain kinds of wrongdoing are being singled out, but it's really that public element that's the difficulty in this situation.
I mean, one of the things that's strange to me about this is, well, I'm not a Catholic myself, but it seems to be quite obvious. He was told, this would happen if he voted for this. He would not be given Holy Communion. And when it did happen, then he suddenly kicked up this great stink about it and said, that he was being treated disrespectfully or something. But I mean, it seems, he violated the rules, and that's what happened. I mean, it's not complicated, is it?
I think a lot of that's a lot of the reaction has been to say, well, he wants to have his cake and eat it. Basically, he wants to have the benefits of membership in the Christian community. And a few cynics on Twitter, X, suggested that he might want to get his children into the local Catholic school, and that some of his involvement with the church might be to that end. So he wants the benefits, the spiritual benefits, the aesthetic benefits, whatever he gets from going to Mass, without paying his dues and doing the hard stuff as well. And it's a kind of free riding, and Christian communities can't survive in that way, because you need, there are always going to be people on the fringes and people struggling and finding it hard, and there'll be people who sort of half believe, but you do need that basic coherence and that basic public unity for the community to sustain itself. So I think what's really happened is there's a clash there between, there's an American sociologist who calls it moralistic therapeutic deism, which is this idea that God is somewhat remote and distant in a kind of deist way, and the main thing he wants is for you to be happy and self-fulfilled and all the rest of it, and what you might call the hard bits, the things that feel more punitive, those are pushed to one side. Whereas really the Catholic Church does have, like most long-lasting Christian churches, by necessity, it has disciplinary structures. It has strict requirements of what you need to do to continue in good standing. And I don't think anyone would say that all of those are easy all the time. But I think for someone to choose to be an MP, to seek to be in that position of power, then to contradict very publicly what the church says about a very important issue and still expect that not to affect his relationship with the Christian congregation, a lot of people have found that staggering, and it shows perhaps he's never really had the faith explained to him. Catholic catechesis has really declined in the last few decades. A lot of people just don't know the faith and don't understand why the church says the things it does. So it's possibly not really his fault. And if you read the things he said since the weekend, it's pretty clear that I don't think he really gets it. So in a sense, he's been let down by the church not making things clear.
And to take that just a bit further, I mean, it does seem to me that this sort of secular kind of lifestyle, take it or leave it understanding of faith is a very impoverished understanding of it, really, because, surely it's a set of quite strong moral demands that you do actually have to give a part of yourself to, or all of yourself, really. And so, you can't just say, if you're an MP, you're this very important public political role, that you can just discard this whole moral edifice that you're actually supposed to take very seriously. I mean, it just doesn't seem to compute.
Well, that's it. I think people have been conditioned to view all institutions as having the same kind of, I don't want to use the word squishy, but people view all aspects of life as having, being subject to the usual cliches about inclusion, and they don't realise, I think, that actually the whole world can't work in that way. And as I say, it might be a failing of the churches to bring people on board and to explain things. But I do think it exposes quite a stark divide, actually, between the real hard centre of Christianity and what you might call a kind of socially acceptable, respectable faith. And I think probably one thing that's worth stressing is that moralism in itself isn't the point of Christianity. I think that's something people sometimes get wrong. The rules aren't really the point, because fundamentally it's about repentance and reconciliation and recognition of your own faults. But what the rules are there because people need to be pointed in the right direction, the kind of guidance for ordering people's lives in a way that will be fulfilling and best for them. So the rules aren't the point, in the sense, ultimately it's about, I suppose, union with God in theological terms. But that doesn't mean the rules aren't important and that there isn't an underlying kind of moral order to the world.
So there's a potentially squishy understanding of faith from within Christianity, but of course there is also this liberal democrat and secular liberal attitude to it, which is quite disdainful. And I think we have seen that actually throughout the course of the assisted suicide debate, where there's been this suggestion that people, religious people, ought not to bring their views into it, and that's the Christians, there's also Muslims as well, people like Shabana Mahmood. And so it's this sort of thing that, you shouldn't bring theological or private theological ideas into this important matter of public morality. But it does seem very strange that, certain views are being excluded from this public debate and actually, quite illiberal.
There is the idea that we can have secularism and it's just a level playing field and everyone's ideas get to compete on the same level. And there's no special privileges or special claims allowed. But if you really think about how secularism, or how a supposedly secular society has worked out, I don't think you can have that stable equilibrium that nice secularism proposes, where you can have Christianity treated with respect in an overall atheist society. If you look in general, the default mode for non-Christian, for atheist societies, is to treat Christianity quite badly and to exclude it from the public square. So, and that certainly seems to me to be the trajectory that we're on currently. So I think secularism, as I say, is not a stable equilibrium. It's a stage between a Christian society and a non-Christian or anti-Christian society, but it's not stable in itself. And I'm not sure what political conclusions stem from that, because I'm not a theocrat. I don't want to return to a confessional state. But equally, secularism doesn't seem to me to work. As we saw a couple of years ago with the Scottish politician Kate, oh gosh, I forgot her surname.
Forbes.
Kate Forbes. And obviously she hasn't been formally excluded, but there's a very strong informal movement against letting people with certain views hold power. So I don't know how to square the circle with that, because in a sense you can't force a Christian society back into being at this point. But I would push back very strongly against, as you say, the Lib Dem secular idea that religious arguments are somehow inferior, or that they need to be apologised for, or that people aren't allowed to make arguments from religious premises, or that there's something discreditable about doing it. Because everyone has a religious worldview in the sense that they believe something about the purpose of life, the meaning of life, the significance of human people and what human life means, and they argue from those premises. And whether or not you believe in God or in a particular religion is going to affect quite strongly the conclusions you come to. So it really does matter. And I really do resist the secularist idea that not believing is the default option, if you like, because not believing is itself a position, it's a choice, it's something it's a position you come to and needs to be argued for, and it has all sorts of outworkings. So I would say I don't see why politicians should have to declare that they are a Christian any more than someone should have to declare that they're not a Christian, because they're both positions, they're both antagonistic positions that can be argued for and against. And I think it would be much healthier if we had those open arguments. So instead of saying, well, you're just against euthanasia because you're a Christian, you said, well, okay, I don't believe in religion, therefore I think human life doesn't have this intrinsic meaning. That's a much more interesting argument to have than just, oh, you're against this because you're a Christian. It's very dull, really.
And I think you make a good point. This liberalism and secular liberalism, it pretends to a kind of neutrality, but actually, everyone has a worldview, and secular liberalism is itself a worldview. And I think what's clear is that what Coughlin has done here is privileged, essentially, his Lib Dem political worldview over his Catholicism, and he has made a choice there. And you can't just sort of say, well, I'm Catholic, but I do this in public. I mean, it's surely a false binary.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know anything about Chris Coughlin. I hadn't really heard of him before this weekend. Possibly he's a much better man than I am, and he's nice to puppies and orphans. But in that particular respect, yeah, as you say, he's made a choice, and I think in a sense he needs to accept that there are choices to be made in the world, and that choosing certain things cuts off other things. If you want to be in favour of euthanasia, and if you want to be a liberal on abortion law, as Chris Coughlin seems to be, that does prevent you from being a full part of a Catholic community. So you can't, as I say, have your cake and eat it. You've got to choose. You can't ride those two horses.
And so, of course, this is a discussion between, secularism or atheism and Christianity, essentially. And, of course, there's been this talk in the past year of a potential Christian revival that's going on, or at least a quiet one, with more, in particular, young people, taking up Christianity in a way that, many see as quite unexpected, as it has been in decline for quite a long time. So, what do you make of that? Is it something that you've observed, and why do you think it's happening?
Well, I think it's a tricky one, because I personally live out in the sticks in a constituency that's very heavily full of retirees. So when I go to church, I don't see a great influx of youth into the congregation, I must confess. However, I do think there is some quite good data to suggest that something is happening, particularly in younger age groups. So as well as the recent data we've seen about, I think it was something like a 4-fold increase in regular church or regular Catholic attendance among 18 to 30-year-olds or something like that from the beginning of the year. Something like that. a couple of years back, people were asked whether they were planning to attend church at Easter. I think that was last Easter. And something between 15 or 20% of young people said they were planning to attend church at some point over Easter, which was significantly up on previous years. So, I mean, the data is still, I think, incomplete, but I think there's enough data from here, from France, and from the US to say that the decline in observance certainly seems to be levelling off at least, and that, in certain age groups, possibly in certain parts of the country, there does seem to be an increase in attendance across quite a few denominations. What that means, I don't really know. I'm slightly Eeyorish by temperament about these kind of things, and I would very much like to be wrong. And I hope that there is actually the first glimmerings of a revival happening. Obviously, part of it is to do with demographic change. I think the demography of under 30s in Britain looks a lot different from the demography of, say, over 60s. And a lot of newcomers are from countries where church attendance is just much higher in general, like West Africa, for example. So that's part of it. But I think even taking that into account, the stories you hear about people who say, never really been interested in church before, or I went as a kid but haven't been for 20 years. I have heard a lot of stories like that, and I'm hearing them from a lot of different places. Maybe I'm just selecting the anecdotes I like hearing. But I think there is something happening, a small scale maybe, but I think there is something happening.
Okay, and so you mentioned demographics there, and of course that's another big ongoing political issue that has really broken into debate a lot recently. And of course that's largely because of this study by Professor Matt Goodwin of the Centre for Heterodox Social Science recently, which finds that by 2063, on current trends, the white British proportion of the population is set to become a minority. And so this weekend, Goodwin gave an interview to The Spectator, basically including on that question of whether or not Englishness is an ethnicity. And so let's just play a clip of that.
My view is Englishness is an ethnicity that is deeply rooted in a people that can trace their roots back over generations. It is a very distinctive identity and a different identity from Britishness. So I think somebody could identify as British, and they can be British, but they cannot simultaneously identify as English.
So Niall, what do you make of those comments?
Well, I think it's a tricky area, I think, because I do absolutely recognise why people get a bit uncomfortable with talking about ethnic identity, and particularly about conceiving of a nation in terms of ethnic identity. For obvious reasons, if you look back at the history of Europe in the last century, people get very touchy about that. But equally, nations and peoples are real things, and there are real differences between peoples in the world. And countries that cease to be made up of one people and one particular nation, or cease to be dominated by one particular group, are going to look very different from countries that remain dominated by a particular group. And I think the way I sometimes think about this when I want to raise the subject sensitively is to say to people, if you look at the travel advice for, say, a single woman traveling in the world, look at the advice that's given. Say a friend of yours is traveling to Iceland or Japan by herself. The advice you give her is going to be a bit different from the advice you would give her if she were traveling to Egypt or India or various other places in the world. And I think it is true that a country that is 40 or 50% white British, in terms of its customs, its public life, its levels of corruption, its levels of trust, how the streets feel, is going to be very different from the country that I grew up in the 1980s and 1990s. we're looking at unprecedented demographic change throughout our history, despite all the nonsense you hear about us being a country of immigrants and all the rest of it. We've never seen anything like this before, and it's happened so quickly. Because something that stuck with me, I once read that there are 3 questions about immigration: pace, type, and size. Like, who's coming, how quickly are they coming, and how many of them are coming. So I think that's what's really changed in the last 20 or 30 years, and what has made the ethnicity question really come to the fore, is that you can afford to be generous and not really think about the boundaries of ethnicity when you've not got this huge change happening. So a couple of months ago, Frank Bruno declared he was an Englishman. And I personally, for Frank Bruno, I don't have any instinctive reaction against him being an Englishman. But when you've got 500,000, 1 million newcomers coming in every year, you do have to start thinking about those boundaries. You do have to start thinking about what England is, what Britain is, what the kind of founding stock, if that's the kind of expression you can use, looks like, and how the situation will change by the middle of this century, by the end of this century, if the founding stock are down to 20, 30, 40%. As I say, I can see why that makes people uncomfortable. You do have to think about it. Like, I think about it in terms of, say, if you have a party with 20 people and 2 people bring uninvited guests, that's not a big problem. But what if 5 people bring uninvited guests? What if 10 people bring uninvited guests? Then you need to start being a lot more protective of the integrity of your party. Or if you have a village of 1,000 people, if 3 or 4 new families move in, that's fine. You don't need to worry about that. But what if 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 new families move in? And what if a lot of those families don't like how things are done in the village and come from completely different backgrounds to other people in the village? Quite soon, the village starts to look and feel different. And again, these are really difficult questions, and I see the danger of ethnic identification. But equally, I don't think Europeans always understand how unusual they are in the world in not seeing the world through an ethnic lens, or trying very hard not to see the world through an ethnic lens. Most other people in the world are very focused on their group and their people. And I think it's a very sad reality that Europeans will become more that way because of demographic change.
One of the things that's been interesting about this debate, as it's become more prominent, is that from simply stating this fact that the English are an ethnic group, it sort of provokes all kinds of outrage and fury. And I think people sort of take it to imply an entire policy platform, which is, seems to be like deporting all non-white people or something. That it doesn't actually imply, simply, acknowledging this fact, and that Matt Goodwin, for instance, was not saying that. And so, I mean, it's strange, isn't it, Niall, that this sort of ordinary assertion provokes so much fury?
I think it is. And I think we talked a little bit about the decline of Christianity and the possible recovery of Christianity. I think one place where a recovery of Christianity would be really useful is in possibly making it easier to talk about the difficulties of multiculturalism, because when you have the Christian worldview, you have a kind of moral and spiritual basis for believing in the equality of people, whatever the differences in groups are. Morally and in terms of human dignity, no human being is superior to the other. If you don't have that, it's actually a bit difficult to talk about equality as a moral vision. And you have to try and pretend that morality is somehow human equality is an empirical conclusion rather than a metaphysical and spiritual one. So maybe I'm being a bit naive about the brotherhood of man, but I think if you have a Christian country where you have that Christian underpinning that all men are created equal and that we are morally equal and have the same dignity before God, with that underpinning and that backstop, which prevents you from getting into the more unpleasant waters, or should prevent you from getting into the more unpleasant waters of racial identity and racial identitarianism, you can actually have a bit more of an honest conversation about particular cultures, because you have that objective standard with which to talk about what good human behavior is and what good cultures are, and you have a kind of underlying flaw of human equality. And I think if you don't have that, if you have a materialist view of the world, it becomes a bit more difficult to talk about human equality. So I suppose, sorry, that's a bit of a diversion. But I think one way to square that circle is to separate equality as a moral and spiritual ideal and as an empirical claim, which is obviously not going to hold up if you look at the world. There are certain places, there are certain cultures that obviously are less well suited to sort of modern European values, if you like, than others.
Niall Gooch, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks very much, Laurie. Good to be here.
Now, the Trump administration is at the forefront of a global fight back against climate alarmism and eco-Malthusianism. And here to discuss that this week, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Tilak Doshi, who is the Daily Sceptic's energy editor. Welcome, Tilak.
Thank you, Laurie. Great to be here.
Yeah, good to have you here. So you've written for us this week about Trump's gold standard science executive order, which in his view is restoring integrity to the scientific process, but which has been criticized by many as politicizing science himself. Well, so tell us a bit about what that order is doing, and is that a fair characterization? Is he just politicizing it?
Yeah, I consider myself relatively objective, even though I've got clearly thought out ideas about how science should be, like all of us do. I mean, we are social scientists in some form or fashion, amateurs or professionals. But looking fairly at the data out there, it was very clear to most of us, at least, working the area of the environment, economics, climate change, that the science was already so politicized that, in fact, the major problem...
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.